Welcome to this week's hot topic episode. I love the topic of this week. As you can imagine, there is not just one cut and dried answer, which is why I'm doing a hot topic on this question and this topic, because if it were a yes or no, or do this or do that answer, things would be a lot easier. So we are going to tackle the topic of when is it better to do intermittent fasting? Is it better to fast through breakfast and to fast through breakfast and eat lunch and dinner? Or is it better to fast through dinner and focus on breakfast and lunch? And like I was alluding to, there's a lot of variables that go into play here. So, a lot of times people just like to say, oh, it's better to not eat breakfast, or it's better to not eat dinner. And for some people, this certainly can be true. But I want to walk you through what strategy might be the most helpful for you and your lifestyle, your disease process, if you are struggling with overall chronic illness, and really what is going to help you stick with a low insulin lifestyle that includes intermittent fasting and fasting protocols. I do want to say it's been an exciting week. We had Low Insulin Academy open for enrollment last week. We got a ton of students signed up, and we're off and running into week one. If you were disappointed that you missed enrollment, no big deal. I'll open it again in January of 2024. And you can get yourself on the wait list. It's going to be a while, but you can get yourself on the wait list for the next round that is opening in January of 2024. If you really want to get going on the content and you just the enrollment just totally slipped your mind, you can always do the on-demand version, which includes all of the same lessons. And then you can always upgrade to the live course come January or whenever the next round is that you want to join live. But let's get back to this topic at hand, because for a long time, and when I wrote my book, Fast to Heal, I mainly talked about, not eating breakfast and just fasting through breakfast and focusing on, eating later in the morning, or having lunch as your first meal, or having, late afternoon, or maybe just doing one meal a day on some days, just to reverse your metabolic disease process, reverse type 2 diabetes, start to restore some insulin sensitivity. But again, there's really no cut and dried answer about this. But I will say that in more recent months, there have been reviews done of all of the fasting studies that are out there. Unfortunately, there are not a lot of studies on fasting because nobody wants to fund fasting protocols. There's no money to be made. Big food certainly doesn't want to support fasting protocols that take away from people being addicted to, their ultra processed nasty foods that are high in things that are super addictive. They want you to eat more often, eat as often as possible, rather than, implementing intermittent fasting. But with the review that has been recently done, it has been shown for many disease states, chronic illness, and reestablishing insulin sensitivity, that fasting through dinner might be better for many people rather than fasting through breakfast. So let's unpack this. Let's kind of peel the layers back and talk about which protocol might work better for different types of people. So let's look at the fasting through breakfast, which is more of the traditional intermittent fasting that most people do. It's like when we think about intermittent fasting, we think about skipping breakfast and not eating until lunch or late morning, or in some circumstances, even late afternoon or evening. And this can actually really work well for people struggling with prediabetes and type 2 diabetes and fatty liver, which is the bulk of the people that I see for metabolic illness, and a lot of listeners out there. And here's the reason why. When you are type 2 diabetic, and in a lot of circumstances, when you have fatty liver, Those morning blood sugars can be pretty elevated. I get a lot of students frustrated. I get a lot of, people in general who follow me frustrated that they have high morning blood sugars. They're like, well, before I went to bed, my blood sugar was 95 and I wake up, it's 115. What gives? And I've done complete podcasts on this and why this happens. This is the dawn phenomenon. It's very common, but you get a surge of counter-regulatory hormones in the early morning hours that bump up, tell the liver to release some of that stored glycogen and that blood sugar. So it bumps your blood sugar up. This is completely normal. But when you have type 2 diabetes and prediabetes and fatty liver, this can, this can be a really sensitive thing to your body. So, it might shoot your blood sugar up by 20, 30 points, whereas someone with very regulated blood sugar with high insulin sensitivity, you might not even notice the bump up. You might go from 80 to 85 and not even really notice the increase in blood sugar if you're very insulin sensitive. But those with blood sugar issues, this can be more pronounced. And so fasting through breakfast and eating later in the day can be very helpful if this is if you are struggling with high morning blood sugars, because there's no reason for you, if your morning blood sugars are already high and you're trying to burn out extra glycogen in the liver, extra glycogen in the muscle tissue, extra sugar and extra fat that's stored all around the body, there's no reason for you to have to eat breakfast. Your body's working hard to reduce the amount of blood sugar and burn off that extra energy as it is. So if you're not hungry, and a lot of times people aren't as hungry in the morning because of these counter-regulatory hormones, especially those with blood sugar regulation, because their blood sugar's already running kind of high, you can go ahead and implement the traditional intermittent fasting. I would say it's more traditional to skip breakfast and not eat until later. Burn some of that blood sugar out. You have plenty circulating in your bloodstream. It's already high. So there's no reason for you to go and, eat a meal as soon as you get up in the morning. So this scenario can actually work better for a lot of people who are struggling with type 2 diabetes and fatty liver and even pre-diabetes. Or if you're just having, some baseline higher morning blood sugars, why not wait, especially if you're not hungry, and go and, burn some of that extra sugar out and eat later in the day. Now, on the flip side of that, if somebody is struggling with adrenal issues or thyroid issues, or cortisol issues where they know, your cortisol is dysregulated, and that, kind of goes back to those adrenal issues. If you have low cortisol in the morning, where your cortisol is supposed to be the highest in the morning to wake you up and to make you feel, like you want to get up and start the day and be productive. If that's dysregulated, if you're someone who, I'm a good example of this. I had my cortisol tested a couple of years ago, and my cortisol was quite low in the morning, even though I'm a morning person. And that's from years of just burning yourself out and being stressed, being a mom of 3 and running a business and getting up early and feeling like you have fit a workout in and feed your kids good food and running to all their activities and not getting enough sleep and just, all the things that we're doing, sometimes that can bring us some adrenal issues. So if this is you, it may be to your advantage. And one more disease state would be polycystic ovarian syndrome, or PCOS. In these circumstances, it may work better for you or to your advantage to fast through dinner rather than fasting through breakfast. And here is why. With these issues, so if you have cortisol issues, your cortisol is too low in the morning, you've kind of flatlined that cortisol, you've just overextended your adrenal gland for years and years, and you're working to reverse that process and really bring your stress down and reestablish normal cortisol levels. Cortisol levels are going to be higher in the morning and then lower in the evening. And then the counter hormone of cortisol is melatonin. Melatonin is going to rise in the evening. and, get you ready for sleep and rejuvenating and just recovery during the nighttime hours. So those hormones can sometimes be backward. And this actually happens a lot with women suffering from PCOS. These, for some reason or another, your circadian rhythms just get out of balance because of the hormonal balances that you are dealing with. And, high stress and not sleeping enough really can exacerbate PCOS. And a lot of times women suffering from polycystic ovaries have, low cortisol or real high higher than normal cortisol, because they haven't quite gotten to the point of adrenal burnout where they have too much cortisol, but their adrenal gland is still, just kind of overproducing cortisol. So a lot of women, and I saw this with my daughter who struggles with PCOS. She had, her cortisol levels were off, and she had a heck of a time getting up in the morning for, many months, but she was a complete night hawk. Like, it was hard for her to wind down and prepare herself to go to sleep. She'd want to be up till midnight. And that was her time to, get her homework done and feeling like she could conquer the world, because her cortisol was very imbalanced. So she's having low cortisol in the morning when it's supposed to be high and, kind of get you going for the day, and high cortisol levels at night. And that can be very counterproductive, because then you can't wind down, you can't prepare your body for sleep. And it's really tough to get up in the morning. So fasting through dinner and eating earlier can help you to reestablish these cortisol and adrenal issues. So whether or not you have, adrenal fatigue, or that your cortisol levels are off, or you have PCOS, thyroid, hypothyroidism would be another indication that you might want to try fasting through dinner rather than fasting through breakfast, because a lot of times with hypothyroid, same thing, the adrenal glands burned out, and, cortisol issues and thyroid hormones are not optimized. So having breakfast, eating, and it's not like you have to if you get up at 6, you have to eat like right away at 6 o'clock. Like, sometimes that's just really hard for people, but maybe your eating window is like 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. and you don't have to eat after 3 p.m. Or you try a 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. window, or an 8 p.m. to eating a later lunch at 1 or 2, something like that. And then fasting through dinner to, try to tell your body, like, okay, like, we need to bring these cortisol levels up in the morning and down at night. And we got to kind of reestablish our natural circadian rhythms of, having more energy in the morning, getting up with the sunlight, and going to bed with the darkness. So that would be called circadian fasting. And eating in, hours of daylight can be very helpful to kind of reestablish those patterns. And with that same meta-analysis that I was talking about before, with people who, looking at all of the studies that have been done on fasting thus far, it was shown that, stopping eating after or before, 4 p.m. kind of being your cutoff, that is helpful for reestablishing natural circadian rhythms. And it was very helpful for people with thyroid issues and women with PCOS. Those were the best case scenarios to help reverse those disease states. Because something we want to be very mindful of and be aware of is that, for the most part, most people, the vast majority of people, we all have a little bit different circadian rhythms. Like, I'm a very early morning circadian rhythm person. I wear an Oura ring, and it says, like, you're only 10% of people have your real early morning circadian rhythm, meaning, like, I'm usually like, my body's awake and ready to go at 5:30 in the morning. That's kind of my natural circadian rhythm. And then by 9:30, it's like I'm winding down and preparing my body for sleep. I'm usually sleeping around 9:30, 10 o'clock. If it's a normal day where I'm not, having to be up later, or I'm not waiting for my teenagers to get home or whatever it is. I like to be asleep by 9:30, 10 o'clock, and that's an early circadian rhythm. So, you want to be mindful of those, types of things, like what kind of person are you an early morning person? Are you a late night person? Another thing that gets thrown into the whole, complex, the complexities of life is shift work for a lot of people. And this can be really, really tough for people because they can't establish a natural circadian rhythm because their working hours are shifting from week to week, and they might be working nights one week and they're working days the next week, they're working second shift the week after that, so that definitely makes it a little more challenging. But what I was going to say earlier is that we are all more insulin sensitive. Like we're the most insulin sensitive, like midday. So I talked about how we, we release those counter regulatory hormones early in the morning. And we kind of get that a little bit of a bump in glucose to prepare our body for the day, to get our body some energy as we're waking up. Midday is when we're most insulin sensitive. So it makes sense regardless of, if you're eating lunch as your first meal or you're fast, you're eating a little bit earlier, eating your largest meal around midday usually works best for most people because we're just naturally, as humans, we're most insulin sensitive midday. So I've kind of changed when I eat my first meal. And again, it's going to vary from day to day, but it's usually somewhere between 10:30 and 11:30, where I used to try to wait until at least noon, sometimes 1 o'clock, sometimes even 2 o'clock. And for my natural circadian rhythm and my biorhythms, that just was kind of counterproductive for me because I'd been up so many hours. I'm an early morning person. So it's like, as I read the literature and I became more aware of these little nuances of, people and their overall schedule, I thought, why am I waiting until, late in the afternoon to eat my, most of my calories and my intake when I'm pretty much always exercising early in the morning. I'm up early. I do not have type 2 diabetes, and I am very metabolically flexible and healthy. So I moved my eating window back from the time that I break my fast most days, a little bit earlier. And now I'd like to cut off my dinner time a little bit earlier because I just get hungry a little bit earlier and, in the evening. Now I'm, when I eat at 10:30, I'm hungry around 4:30. And so I like to eat an earlier dinner. Totally understand that social, what you do socially and what your family's doing is completely going to dictate when you're eating too. I mean, we have to be flexible with this. I'm giving you the latest research and kind of talking you through, if you have different chronic illness, what might work well for you. But we definitely have to take into consideration our families, our social schedules. If we're meeting somebody out for dinner, we don't want to say, oh, I can't ever meet you for dinner because I have to be done eating by 4 p.m. every single day. Like, we don't want to be stringent like that and completely restrictive. We can be flexible, but if you have, if you're suffering from these different disease states, then it might be to your advantage to try a different approach to intermittent fasting. And again, we do tend to be the most insulin sensitive, kind of in that midday area. So again, for me, it didn't make sense for me to put this huge amount of food into my body, late afternoon when I'm already kind of past the peak. And my body is really active and, my biorhythm is earlier in the day, where some people are just like more naturally night people. And some of this might have to do with, your circadian rhythms and, your cortisol being off, but sometimes people are just naturally more, later morning people where they just really don't want to get up at 5:30. Their body's not ready to go till like 8 or 9 a.m. And that's perfectly okay. So, you know, eating lunch and dinner when your biorhythm's a little bit later might work a lot better for you. And that's okay. It's like, well, however you're making progress and whatever fits your schedule socially is what you want to do. So there's different times, like I vary my fasting schedule a lot too. It's like if I'm traveling throughout the morning, I don't want to eat in the car. I'm going to wait till we get to wherever it is our destination is. And maybe it's noon, 1 o'clock before I eat that day. Maybe there's many days that I just fast through dinner because I'm not that hungry because I've eaten a large amount of protein and some fat for my first meal. I'm not that hungry. My kids have activities, so I just fast through dinner. And I do a 22 or 24-hour fast that day. And that's okay too. It's like there's no right or wrong here. What I do want to say is if you're struggling with some of these chronic illnesses, it may be to your advantage to do your intermittent fasting for what works for you and what's going to help reverse your personal disease state. But you always just want to be flexible and socially acceptable. And if you're having dinner with your family every single night and you want to eat with them, that's okay. And, fasting through breakfast can definitely work. It's just all about what's going to help you reestablish insulin sensitivity, what's going to help you reverse your disease state, what's going to help you, feel better and, see some weight loss, change your body composition, get rid of brain fog, all of these things come into play. So again, no right or wrong. What I do want you to be mindful of as well, especially if you're, fasting more, you're more so fasting through dinner, like you're more of a breakfast and lunch kind of person or a late morning, late afternoon meals, kind of like what I do. I do like late morning and late afternoon or early evening. Those are typically the meals that I do. Keep in mind, your body does release some carbohydrates in the early morning hours. So you've gotten, an increase in carbohydrates. We don't need to eat a lot of carbohydrates at our first meal. So that's another reason why we've just gotten into such a metabolic mess and disaster with our bodies, is we've been told to eat right when we get up in the morning. We've been told to eat all of these typical breakfast foods that are either simple carbohydrates, or even if they're complex carbohydrates, they're really high carbohydrate foods. We don't need to dump 100 grams of carbohydrate. We don't even need to dump 50 grams of carbohydrates into our bodies as soon as we wake up, because our bodies have done that for us. We want to burn out that extra glucose. So no matter when you're fasting, especially if you're breaking your fast earlier in the day, make it high protein and low in carbohydrate, because you don't need the extra carbohydrate in the morning. And eating high protein is going to help you regulate those blood sugars throughout the entire day, because protein is the macronutrient that helps with blood sugar regulation more than anything else. It helps you to stay full. It tells your appetite and, your appetite and satiety centers that I'm full, I've nourished, I have enough building blocks to build hormones and to build neurotransmitters to establish whatever tissues have been broken down or sloughed off, or, that I'm done with. I need amino acids. I need fatty acids. I don't need a lot of carbohydrate. So it makes your body really happy. So no matter what, especially if you're breaking your meal earlier in the morning or, early morning, mid morning, late morning, make it high protein, low in carbs. I like to tell my students less than 20 grams of carbs for that first meal, especially if it's in the morning hours. And then that meal later in the day, you can have a little bit more carbohydrates because your body is more insulin sensitive. Like, it's better at utilizing carbohydrate a little bit later in the day, not late at night. Like, I don't eating at night, late at night is never helpful for anybody. I mean, you're just not insulin sensitive at all late in the evening. Like, after 5, 6, you grow less and less insulin sensitive because your body's winding down. It wants to repair, restore. It does not want to produce energy. It doesn't want a lot of energy coming in. So Eat with your natural biorhythms. And then, when you're first starting out, just kind of put some parameters around your eating window. Like, I'm going to have a 6-hour window. And I'm going to reduce my carbohydrate load. I'm going to focus on meals. Those are your first steps. I'm going to focus on whole meals that are balanced and not eating at night, not snacking in between meals, not drinking sugary drinks in between meals. Those are your first parameters to put on your eating. And then once you get a little bit more established, you can play around with your fasting window. Try fasting through dinner a couple days a week, see how you feel. Try fasting through breakfast a couple days a week and changing it up. Maybe 2 days a week you're fasting through breakfast, 2 days a week you're fasting through dinner. Those can be helpful methods, and just try it out and see how you're feeling. One last thing to note before we close out is caffeine intake. And, I've talked a lot about adrenal health and cortisol issues in this episode. Another thing to keep in mind is a lot of caffeine in the early morning prior to food. If you are fasting all throughout the morning and you haven't eaten any food and you have adrenal and cortisol issues, sometimes this can be problematic because excessive caffeine and a lot of caffeine can, make the adrenal gland work even harder and, make those adrenal and cortisol issues even worse and intensify them. So that is a time where, if you are really addicted to coffee and you're relying on caffeine to kind of wake you up, that's a sign that your adrenal gland's pretty fatigued and you want to back off on the caffeine and try to establish an earlier eating window, heal up those hormones and, see if that gets you going with some better progress and, try to heal those adrenal issues that you might have going on. So I hope that this is helpful. Again, there's no right or wrong. You kind of got to play around with things. That's why I love intermittent fasting and this lifestyle. It's flexible. You do what you need to do from day to day. You do what works for your family socially. And, you just kind of change things up and each day can be a little bit different. So hope you learned a lot. I'll see you back next week for another episode.